The American Revolutionary War did not start for freedom or independence, and we're going to talk about it today. It's amazing to me how much I think I know history, and then after doing just a little bit of research, just a cursory Google here or there, I find out that I'm totally wrong. I don't know if that's because the movies that I watched growing up painted a specific narrative, and I just trusted Hollywood's depiction of events, or if I was just a terrible student. I mean, most likely both are true. I mean, I watched The Patriot, and I wanted to believe that it was like the real events that happened.
Stupid boy.
I mean, that's easy, right? You show it to me and I believe it. And to be completely honest, Miss Sneed's world history class was absolutely boring and terrible. She didn't help me love history by any means. I mean, I failed her class. But real history can be just as exciting as fake history, but more importantly, it's true. And that's what today is about. I was given this depiction that, we signed the Declaration of Independence and we started off, having the Revolutionary War. That's not what happened. And to find out what really happened, we have to go all the way back to the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War was the North American version of the 7 Years' War that was going on in Europe. It was between England and France, and over in America, they had both allied themselves with Native American tribes. The French were actually winning until this guy named William Pitt, who was Britain's Secretary of State, decided it was in Britain's best interest to win the war in North America to protect the American colonies. There's a lot of resources over there, things that would be very good for England over time. And his strategy was to dump a ton of money into the war effort, and it worked. Ultimately, England beat France in the North American version of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and they signed the Treaty of Paris in 1763. So now everything's great. The English beat the French, the American colonies actually fought with the English against the French, but guess what? All that money that William Pitt poured into the French and Indian War was a huge debt for England. And so the English thought, hey, what better way to pay this debt back than by making the American colonies pay it back for us? I mean, this war was essentially fought in North America to protect them. It only seems right that they would pay it back for us.
You pay it back.
However, this marked the very beginning of a cascade of taxes and also tensions. The Sugar Act of 1764 was Britain's first attempt to raise taxes on the colony. And it actually wasn't a new tax, it was a renewed crackdown on an old tax, the Molasses Act of 1733. Now, before this, they had passed this act, but not really enforced it. But now, since the English debt was so high, they decided, hey, let's renew this Molasses Act and we'll make the money. It also expanded the list of items that were being taxed. And technically, this wasn't a direct tax, it was a duty that was collected at the ports. And as you can imagine, the colonists were not happy. In fact, Sam Adams, the future revolutionary, called it a direct assault on the subjects of Britain. And to make matters worse, Parliament passed what was called the Currency Act right after that. And basically this was saying that in order to pay these duties, you couldn't use colonial dollars, you had to use gold or silver, which I don't know about you, but I have a ton of gold and silver laying around. So yeah, the colonists were furious. They had to barter to get gold and silver to be able to pay the duties on these items that were being taxed in the Sugar Act. So naturally, the colonists began boycotting all of the items that were associated with the Sugar Act. And this is when it became less about the money and more about control, controlling the British subjects, which are the American colonies in the eyes of Great Britain. And Parliament passed next what we call the Stamp Act of 1765. And the Stamp Act was the first direct tax on the American colonists. It taxed everything from newspapers all the way to playing cards, all this printed material, stuff that people used on a daily basis. It was a direct tax and the colonists had to pay for it. So naturally, if the colonists felt disrespected when there were taxes put on sugar and molasses at ports of entry, then even more so they felt disrespected and really kind of punched in the gut when it came to the Stamp Act. So the response to this was a rise in rebellion. There was a group of people called the Sons of Liberty that sort of rose up at this time under the leadership of Samuel Adams. And these protests began to get violent. In fact, in one case, they actually hung the effigy of one stamp collector named Andrew Oliver in what was a very clear message. We are not happy about this, and if you choose to enforce the Stamp Act, it's at your own risk. So Parliament heard this and they repealed the Stamp Act, which seemed like a win for the colonists. But on the heels of the repealing of the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which basically said, hey, we are your sovereign leadership and we have the right to pass acts on top of that. I think it's really important to understand that, at this time the American colonies had been operating in and of themselves. They really didn't have a lot of leadership outside of the leadership in their own communities. They weren't governed from a everyday perspective by Britain and the Crown, or Parliament for that matter. So these new acts seemed like a huge infringement upon their daily lives and their rights. So in 1767, Parliament passed another series of acts called the Townshend Acts. And while the Townshend Acts did tax things like glass and paper and tea, it really wasn't about money. It was really about showing the colonies that, hey, we have the right to pass these things on you. And these items that they did tax were everyday items that they could only really get from England. They couldn't make these things in America, and so they had to import them.
It's brilliant. Quite brilliant.
Well, naturally, the colonists rejected this just like they did the Stamp Act, and so there was a spirit of rebellion in the air for these guys, and they began boycotting all of these things. In fact, they started trying to make as much of this stuff in the colonies as they possibly could and not import really anything, if possible, from Britain. And all of this rebellion and the spirit in the air sort of boiled over in 1770 when the king sent over a bunch of British troops. They were in Boston at that time. One night, particular protesting was going on. There was an angry crowd of Bostonians who were protesting, and there were 9 British troops in the same area, and all of a sudden, one of the British troops fired their gun, which caused other British troops to fire their guns, and 5 Bostonians were dead at the end of the skirmish, and this is what was known as the Boston Massacre, and it happened in 1770. And really, it was a tipping point in this rise in tensions between the colonists and Great Britain. And so now you have these British troops, and they went to trial, but they were basically acquitted except for 2 of them. But it did nothing to lower the tensions in Boston specifically, but in the overall American colonies at that time. So 3 years later, in 1773, Parliament passed what was called the Tea Act. And this act was really more geared toward helping save the East India Company, which was a big merchant company that Britain used. And the Tea Act basically said that only tea from the East India Company is going to be able to be imported into the American colonies, and the colonists would have to pay for it. And further, they were really cracking down on smuggling at this time, so it was very difficult for the American colonists to smuggle tea in from other places because the crackdown was so big. So, on the night of December 16th in 1773, a group of men from the Sons of Liberty, most likely, snuck aboard the East India Company's ships at night, dressed as Native Americans, probably under the leadership of Samuel Adams, and they dumped 90,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. And this would have been worth about $1.5 million in today's world. And this was obviously the Boston Tea Party. So as you can see, everything is escalating. Parliament will pass one act, the colonists will protest in some way, Parliament will either change it or repeal it, and then pass another act. And that is sort of the method that's been going on all the way through the Boston Massacre and even into the Boston Tea Party. So King George at this point in time was fed up with the colonists. He and Parliament passed what was called the Coercive Acts, but in the American colonies they were called the Intolerable Acts. And there were actually a lot of things in the intolerable acts, but one of the big things is that they shut down Boston Harbor, and Massachusetts was no longer able to govern itself, and so you've got a ton of British troops living in Boston at this time. And so this was the new way of life, and by 1775, you've got American colonists sort of coexisting with British troops in a city. And at one point in time, the British Army decided that they were going to go take some weapons that were being stored in Concord, Massachusetts. And of course, the colonists found out about this, and this guy named Paul Revere made his midnight run letting everybody know, hey, the British are coming, the Redcoats are coming. And on the way to Concord was this other town called Lexington, and that's where the first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired. And that happened in April of 1775. Now, obviously, things had escalated to a serious point. That happened in April. 3 months later, in July, the Continental Congress convened and they came up with the Olive Branch Petition. Now, this is on our side, the American colonist side. They came up with the Olive Petition that said basically, hey, King George, can we just forget that everything happened? You guys repeal all the taxes, we'll stop all the fighting, and everything can just go back to the way it was. And this was sent to King George, and it was said that King George didn't even read it. He just dismissed it, and he said that the colonies were already in open rebellion, and so there was no choice but to go over and through military might show the colonies who the boss is. And to me, this is proof right here that the American Revolutionary War did not start for independence. They were passing acts in 1775 asking, hey, King George, we are British subjects, we are British citizens, we want to go back to the way it was, but King George would not accept that. Now, there were people who wanted freedom and independence from Great Britain in the colonies prior to that, but it wasn't the reason the fighting started. And in fact, it wasn't until King George rejected the Olive Branch Petition that idea began to escalate, and it went from higher than the people like the Sons of Liberty to some of the founding fathers like George Washington and John Hancock and John Adams. Remember, the Declaration of Independence wasn't signed until 1776, actually a full year from the time that the Continental Congress signed the Olive Branch Petition. So they had already been fighting for over a year before America declared its independence from Great Britain. So King George had an opportunity to put down the rebellion and keep the colonies as part of the British Empire, but he chose not to. And so really what started the American Revolutionary War was the economic pressure that was being applied to the colonists through these acts and these restrictions that were happening. Also, the political control. They had been functioning as basically their own entity, understanding that they were British subjects, but that the Parliament and the Crown did not play a role in their daily lives. And then the escalation of violence. Once British troops were moved into Boston alongside colonial citizens, as a show of force, it was only a matter of time before tensions would rise to the point where violence would happen. So I'm sure Miss Sneed told me all about this in class and I didn't care because I was too busy watching The Patriot, and I did fail her class for whatever reason. But history is messy and it's not exactly the way we think it is, but it really is important for us to understand. Mainly so that we understand that these people were a lot like you and I, and maybe the times aren't so different. It's really important for us to understand what was going on in colonial America at that time, what the implications were for the colonists and for the crown, and what gives you the right.